You see, when you encounter someone who seems emotionally distant, almost untouched by what's happening around them, it's easy to assume you're looking at strength. It can feel like they're in control, like they're somehow above the messiness of human emotion. But what you're often witnessing is not strength at all, it's protection. It's a carefully constructed shield that was built long before you ever entered their life. Because no one is born disconnected, no one comes into this world wanting to shut people out. That kind of emotional distance is learned. It's shaped through experiences where vulnerability didn't feel safe, where expressing needs may have been ignored, dismissed, or even punished. And so, over time, the psyche adapts. It says, if being open leads to pain, then I will no longer be open. And what you see on the surface, the indifference, the coldness, the lack of reaction, is actually the end result of that adaptation. Now here's where it becomes complicated. When someone like this begins to feel something real, when they meet a person who matters, someone who stirs emotions they've spent years trying to suppress, it doesn't suddenly open them up. It does the opposite. It intensifies the defense. Because now there's more at stake. Now there's something to lose. So instead of leaning in, they pull back. Instead of expressing care, they become more distant. And this is the part that confuses people the most. You think, if I matter, why are they acting like this? But from their internal world, the question is very different. It's, if I let myself feel this, what will it cost me? You have to understand, vulnerability to them doesn't feel like connection, it feels like danger. It feels like losing control, like being exposed in a way they've trained themselves to avoid. And so they create distance, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and don't know how to hold it. And if you're not aware of this dynamic, you might start personalizing it. You might begin to believe that you're not enough, that you're not worth showing up for, that somehow their coldness is a reflection of your value. But it isn't. It's a reflection of their history. It's a reflection of wounds that were never given the space to heal. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It doesn't mean you should accept emotional unavailability or lose yourself through ying to break through someone's walls. But it does change how you interpret what you're seeing. It shifts you from self-blame to understanding, from confusion to clarity. Because once you see that the mask of indifference is just that, a mask, you stop chasing it. You stop trying to prove yourself worthy of warmth from someone who is afraid of their own feelings. And instead, you begin to ask a different question. What kind of connection do I truly deserve? And that's where your power is. Not in breaking their defenses, but in recognizing them for what they are, and choosing not to lose yourself in the process. Because the truth is simple, even if it's not easy. What looks like a lack of feeling is often a fear of feeling, and it is not your job to carry that fear for someone else. And as you begin to see through that mask, something else starts to make sense, why the dynamic often shifts from connection to control. Because when someone doesn't feel safe in emotional intimacy, they will look for another way to create stability. And for many, control becomes that substitute. You might notice it in subtle ways at first. The way they steer conversations, the way they decide when close. Ness happens, and when distance returns. It can feel confusing. One moment they're drawing you in, the next they're pulling away, and somehow you find yourself adjusting, responding, trying to keep the balance. But that balance isn't mutual. It's being managed. Control, in this context, isn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet. It's in the unpredictability. It's in the mixed signals. It's in the way affection is given and withdrawn, just enough to keep you engaged, just enough to keep you wondering. And what this does, over time, is shift your focus. Instead of feeling grounded in yourself, you start orienting around them, around their moods, their availability, their approval. Now, why does this happen? Not because they sit down and consciously plan to control another person, but because control feels safer than connection. Genuine connection requires openness, and openness requires trust. But if trust was broken early in life or never fully formed, then the nervous system doesn't recognize closeness as safe. It recognizes it as a threat. So instead of saying, I care about you, they might try to shape your behavior. Instead of saying, I'm afraid of losing you, they might test your loyalty. Instead of allowing themselves to depend on you emotionally, they try to ensure that you depend on them. Because dependence, in their mind, reduces the risk of abandonment. If you need them, you're less likely to leave. But here's the paradox. The more they try to control the connection, the less genuine the connection becomes. Because love cannot grow in an environment where one person is managing the emotional space. Love requires freedom. It requires the ability for both people to show up as they are, without fear of being manipulated or tested. And this is where it begins to affect you more deeply than you might realize. Because when you're in a dynamic like this, you may start to question yourself. You may think, if I just do this differently, if I just say the right thing, maybe they'll finally relax. Maybe they'll finally open up. But what you're actually doing is slowly stepping away from your own center, trying to meet someone in a place where they are not fully present. And again, understanding this doesn't mean accepting it. It means seeing it clearly. It means recognizing that what feels like intensity is not the same as intimacy. At what feels like pursuit is not the same as presence. And that being wanted in a controlling way is not the same as being loved in a healthy way. Because real connection doesn't require you to earn stability. It doesn't keep you guessing. It doesn't pull you in and push you away just to maintain a sense of power. Real connection allows you to breathe. It allows you to feel seen, not managed. So when you begin to notice control where there should be connection, don't rush to fix it. Pause long enough to ask yourself what role you've been placed into and whether that role honors who you truly are. Because the moment love turns into control, it stops being a place where you can safely belong. And once you start to recognize that pattern of control, another behavior begins to stand out, one that often leaves people even more confused. It's the pattern of disappearance and return. The distance, the silence, the apparent detachment, followed by a sudden reappearance as if nothing ever happened. And you're left wondering, if they don't care, why do they keep coming back? This is where we need to look beneath the surface again. Because true indifference doesn't circle back. When some eon genuinely feels nothing, they don't feel the pull to reconnect. They don't feel the need to check in, to re-enter your space, to remind you of their presence. Indifference is clean. It's final. It moves on. But this pattern you're experiencing, it isn't clean, and it isn't final. It's cyclical. And cycles are driven by something unresolved. You see, when a person struggles with emotional closeness, they often move in waves. They come close enough to feel something real, and then that feeling becomes overwhelming. It triggers the very fears we talked about earlier, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of losing control, the fear of being exposed. So they retreat, they create space. Sometimes they disappear entirely. But here's the part that matters. Distance doesn't erase attachment. It only suppresses it temporarily. And over time, that suppressed attachment begins to surface again. It shows up as curiosity, as longing, as an urge they may not even fully understand. And so, they return. Not necessarily with clarity, not necessarily with emotional maturity, but with that same unresolved pull that brought them back into your life. And when they do, it can feel like validation. It can feel like proof that you matter. Because after everything, the silence, the confusion, the inconsistency, they still come back. And it's natural to interpret that as something meaningful. But we have to be careful here, because returning is not the same as showing up. Reappearing is not the same as being present. Someone can come back into your life without ever truly meeting you in a healthy, grounded way. What you're witnessing is not stability, it's repetition. It's an emotional loop that continues not because it's working, but because it hasn't been resolved. And if you're not aware of this, you can become part of that loop. You can start waiting for the return, holding on to the hope that this time will be different, that this time they'll stay, that this time they'll open up. But hope, in this context, can quietly turn into a kind of emotional trap, one that keeps you invested in potential rather than reality. So the question shifts again. It's no longer, why do they come back? The more important question becomes, what happens when they do? Do they take responsibility? Do they show consistency? Do they create a sense of safety and clarity? Or do they simply restart? The same pattern drawing you back in, only to withdraw again when things begin to feel real? Because attachment without growth leads to repetition. And repetition, no matter how intense it feels, is not the same as love. And this is where your awareness becomes essential. not to judge them, not to label them, but to understand the pattern clearly enough that you don't lose yourself inside it. Because someone returning again and again may reveal that there is something there, but without change, without presence, without accountability, what's there is not enough to build a healthy connection. And the most important realization you can come to is this. Just because someone keeps coming back doesn't mean you have to keep letting them in. And just when you begin to step back from that cycle, when you start reclaiming a bit of your space, something interesting often happens there. Reaction shifts. The same person who once seemed so distant, so unaffected, suddenly becomes more alert, more present, sometimes even agitated. And it can catch you off guard because it doesn't match the image they've been showing you. This is where jealousy enters the picture, and it reveals something rarely put into words. You see, when you begin to move forward, when your energy is no longer centered on them, when your attention starts to go elsewhere, when you begin reconnecting with your own sense of self, it disrupts the dynamic they had grown comfortable with, not because they consciously want to limit you, but because your independence challenges something deeper in them. For someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability, connection often becomes intertwined with a sense of control or familiarity. Even if they kept you at a distance, there was still an unspoken expectation that you would remain available, that your emotional world would, in some way, orbit around them. And when that begins to change, it creates discomfort. Jealousy, in this context, is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. It shows up in small questions, in sudden curiosity about your life, in a shift in tone when you mention other people or new experiences. Other times, it can be more direct, to attempt to reassert presence, to remind you that they're still there, to pull your attention back. But what's important to understand is what this reaction actually means. It's not necessary. Wily a sign of healthy love. It's a sign of attachment mixed with insecurity. It reflects a sense of emotional investment that they may not have been able to acknowledge when things felt stable, but becomes visible the moment that stability is threatened. And this is where many people get pulled back in. Because for a long time, you may have been waiting for some kind of emotional response, some sign that you mattered. And suddenly, here it is. The attention, the interest, the shift in behavior. It can feel like confirmation that what you felt wasn't one-sided. But we have to look at the quality of that response, not just its existence. Because jealousy is not the same as care. It doesn't necessarily come with understanding, respect, or a willingness to grow. It often comes from a place of fear, the fear of losing something familiar, the fear of no longer having that emotional anchor in their life. And fear, when it's not acknowledged, can drive behavior that pulls you back into the same patterns we've already explored. The renewed attention might feel different at first, but if it's rooted in the same unresolved dynamics, it will eventually return to the same cycle. Closeness followed, owed by distance, interest followed by withdrawal. So the question becomes, how do you respond when you see this shift? Not by immediately interpreting it as transformation, and not by shutting it down without awareness, but by staying grounded enough to observe it clearly. To ask yourself, is this coming from a place of genuine openness, or is it a reaction to losing control of the situation? Because real care doesn't only appear when you're pulling away. Real care is consistent. It doesn't depend on your absence to become visible. It doesn't need the threat of losing you in order to show up. And this is where your clarity protects you. It allows you to see that someone's jealousy may reveal that you mattered, but it also reveals the limitations of how they relate to that feeling. And once you understand that, you no longer confuse intensity with sincerity. You no longer mistake reaction for commitment, because when someone only shows you how much you matter when they feel they might lose you, what they're revealing is not the depth of their love, but the depth of their fear. And as you begin to see through these patterns, the distance, the control, the returning, the flashes of jealousy, there's another layer that often becomes visible, and it can be one of the most confusing of all. It's the sense that you're constantly being evaluated, as though the relationship itself is a kind of test you didn't realize you signed up for. You might notice moments where everything feels calm, even close, and then suddenly something shifts. They withdraw, they become critical, or they create a situation that leaves you questioning where you stand. And without realizing it, you find yourself trying to respond in the right way, trying to say the right thing, to react the right way, to somehow pass something that was never clearly defined. But these aren't random moments, they're part of a pattern. When someone has difficulty trusting, especially at a deep emotional level, they often don't move toward reassurance directly. They don't say, "I'm afraid you might leave," or "I need to know I can rely on you." Instead, they create situations that force the question indirectly. They pull away to see if you'll come closer. They create confusion to see if you'll stay steady. They provoke a reaction to see how much you care. And from the outside, it can feel like inconsistent. And see why, like unpredictability. But underneath it, there's a very human question trying to be answered. Are you safe? Can I trust this connection? Will you stay, even when I make it difficult? The challenge is that these tests don't actually build trust. They erode it. Because real trust is not something that's proven through pressure. It's something that's built through honesty, through consistency, through the willingness to be seen without defenses. But when someone relies on testing instead of communicating, they create an environment where you're always slightly off balance. And over time, that imbalance begins to affect you. You may start second-guessing yourself. You may become more focused on their reactions than your own experience. You may begin to feel that you have to earn stability, rather than simply exist within it. This is where the cost becomes clear, not just for them, but for you. Because in trying to meet someone in this space, you can slowly lose contact with your own sense of grounding. You can become so attuned to what they might need, what they might be testing, what they might be feeling, that you lose sight of a much more important question. What do I EAD in order to feel safe and respected in this connection? And this is not about blame. It's about awareness. When you understand that these behaviors come from a place of fear rather than intention to harm, it can soften your perspective. But it should not lower your standards. Compassion does not mean self-abandonment. Understanding does not mean participation in a dynamic that leaves you feeling uncertain or diminished. Because a healthy connection does not require you to prove your worth again and again. It does not place you in a position where your consistency is constantly being measured against someone else's unspoken fears. A healthy connection invites trust, it doesn't extract it through emotional trials. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, something shifts within you. You stop trying to pass the test, and you start recognizing that the test itself is the problem. Because love, in its truest form, is not something you earn by enduring confusion. It's something you experience through clarity, through mutual presence, through the simple grounded knowing that you are accepted as you are. And if someone can only feel secure by testing you, then what they're revealing is not your inadequacy, but their inability to trust without fear. And when you step back and take in the whole picture, the distance that hides vulnerability, the control that replaces connection, the returning that reveals attachment, the jealousy that exposes fear, the testing that stands in for trust, you begin to arrive at a truth that is both difficult and freeing at the same time. What they feel may be real. That's the part many people struggle with, because it challenges a simpler narrative. It would be easier to say they feel nothing, that it's all manipulation, that none of it matters. But human beings are rarely that one-dimensional. Even those who struggle the most with connection are still capable of feeling something meaningful. The issue is not always the absence of feeling, it's the inability to hold and express that feeling in a healthy, consistent way. So yes, there may be care there. There may even be a form of love. But it's a kind of love that hasn't matured. It hasn't developed the qualities that make it safe, reciprocal, and sustaining. It remains tangled with fear, shaped by past wounds, and expressed through behaviors that protect rather than connect, etc. And this is where clarity becomes essential. Because when you recognize that the feeling might be real, there's a temptation to hold on to it, to believe that if it exists, then it can eventually become what you need. You might think, if they care this much underneath it all, then maybe, with enough patience, things will change. But feeling alone is not enough to build a healthy relationship. Love, in its mature form, requires more than emotion. It requires awareness. It requires responsibility. It requires the capacity to show up consistently, to communicate honestly, to consider another person's experience alongside your own. Without those elements, even genuine feelings can lead to harm, not because they're false, but because they're incomplete. And this is the distinction that protects you. You're not being asked to deny what they feel. You're being asked to see it in its full context, to understand that someone can care about you and still not be capable of loving you in a way that nurtures your well-being. That's not a judgment, it's a reality. And when you accept that reality, something shifts internally. You stop trying to translate their behavior into the versions of love you're hoping for. You stop interpreting inconsistency as hidden depth. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. Instead, you begin to anchor yourself in what love actually requires, not just what it feels like, but how it functions. Because real love is not just about how strongly someone feels when they're close to you. It's about how reliably they show up when things are difficult. It's about whether their presence brings clarity or confusion, safety or tension, growth or exhaustion. And when those qualities are missing, no amount of underlying feeling can compensate for that absence. So the invitation here is not to close your heart, but to refine your understanding, to allow yourself to recognize the difference between love that is felt and love that is lived. Because you deserve more than someone who feels something they cannot sustain. You deserve a connection that is not only real in emotion, but real in action, steady, grounded, and capable of meeting you where you truly are. And once you see that clearly, you no longer settle for potential, you choose presence.